Hello, guys and gals, and this is part 10 of our reading of Pandora's Genes. Now, as always, we're going to go over the copyright information first, and then we will go from there. This is a book from 1985. This is an original copy. And as it says here, copyright 1985 by Kathryn Lance, and it says all rights reserved, but I have the artist's permission to read this book on my channel, and I have to always put that in. Also, if you would like a copy of this book or Pandora's Children, which is the second book of the trilogy, or Pandora's Promise, which is the third, then I'm pretty sure that those books are still for sale in most of the big bookstores. And it would be awesome if you could pick up a copy. But anyways, let me check my battery power, 73%. We are doing good that way. And we are going to go over what we went over previously. Okay, in the previous part, which it's been a week since I've read this, so I have to remember, the president, who they call the principal, went on an expedition out of bounds, to a secret place that only him and Zach knew about, and he stayed at a log cabin or something like that with a girl named Lena who was underage, and bad things are probably going to happen there. So, because he has kind of a bad disposition. Anyways, also, Evie, I think it's short for Evelyn. So Evie, got the option of, maybe doing more at the garden than once thought. And we are going to pick it up there. Sorry for all the shaking. I'm just having to switch hands here. Okay. Now, we're going to start back a few paragraphs just because it's been a while since I've read this and I want to make sure that we read everything. Evie sat motionless, the carved back of the wooden chair pressing into her spine. She was confused and not a little frightened. "I don't know," she said finally. "You must decide," said the mistress. Evie felt tears at the backs of her eyes. Like so many things in her life, this necessity for a choice was being thrust on her abruptly, with no time to consider. Then she realized what her answer must be. "I can't decide anything until Zach returns," she said. "Ah, child, you still believe he is alive?" "I know he is." The old woman was silent, and for some reason her lips smacked together while she thought. At last she sighed. You may be right," she said, "but if he were to return, it would only be to see that you are safe. He cannot stay here, and he would not take you with him." The hidden tears began to spill. "You don't know that. Evie, I'm going to tell you something about Zach that you may not wish to hear. When he was a very young man, he did not leave the garden as most boys do. That is, he left the compound, but he remained nearby, supplying our wood, while his wife continued to work here." His wife? Evie felt as if her heart had stopped beating. How could she not have known? All this time she had been waiting for him to come back for her, when in reality he would have returned for another woman. She tried to think who of the older women it might be. Fat Gunda? Proud Mira? Or perhaps she no longer lived here and was waiting for him in the capital. Perhaps he was with her even now. Is she still here?" Evie asked, feeling sick and defeated. "Here? Oh no," said the mistress. She seemed suddenly to come to herself and gaze back at Evie. "She died many years ago, but she is more of a rival to you than you can imagine." Evie just looked at the old woman, embarrassed to be so transparent and wanting to know more, though she feared to hear it. "They married very young, Zach and Leia. We're going to say that's pronounced Leia. They were in love, unusual in these times, but Leia soon conceived a girl child, and less than a year after the marriage gave birth and died of the woman's sickness." Evie bit at her knuckle, her heart breaking for Zach's loss and her own. "It was very soon after that Zach left us for good to join his brother, who had left 2 years before. He told me before he went that he had taken a vow never again to be with a woman, never to cause that to happen again. But men don't have anything to do with the woman's sickness, Evie blurted, wanting even now to talk Zack out of such a dreadful vow. They have everything to do with it, said the mistress. Zack knew that, and I'm sure he has kept his vow all these years. By keeping it, he has helped to carry on our work. Once again, Evie felt the loss of Zack as if it had just happened, yet still she felt that he was alive somewhere and that she would see him again. But she also knew that Zack, once he had made a vow, would let nothing prevent him from keeping it. So you see that if Zack lives, he will never be anything but a father to you, despite your ignorance and impatience. You are a bright girl. We are offering you a rare opportunity. You may join us and stay here working to save the human race. Or if you choose to leave, we will find you suitable husbands, but I can promise you that Zack would have wanted you to stay. Evie felt dizzy. Her world was suddenly turned inside out. This final loss of Zack made her ache all over. Yet another part of her was strangely exhilarated. Whatever the nature of this mysterious work she was being asked to give her life to, is promised to hold more interest than years of poverty with a pair of husbands waiting to die of the woman sickness. Even more important, the work had been important to Zack. If he lived, Zack might someday return and be proud of her. If not, she would keep his memory alive. He had given her a new life. In return, she would take a vow of her own. If she could not be with Zack, then never would she be with any man. As Zack had remained true to his dead wife, so she would remain true to his memory. She approached the mistress and held out her hands. "I will stay," she said. Chapter 6. The ceremony was held on the day exactly 1 year since she had first arrived at the garden. Once it was known that she had chosen, Evie was treated differently, with a new respect, by Gunda, Hilda, Mira, and the other elder women. The younger girls seemed excited and envious of her, while the boy children, as always, went about their business silently, as if they moved in shadows. For the first time, Evie understood what it must be like to grow up knowing that the most important choices in your life had been made for you. Only last week, Jimmy had been delivered to a neighboring farmer who was to take him to the capital. Evie practicing sword work with Katha in the broad front yard, heard his sobs and pleas and wanted to comfort him. Instead, she turned her head and brought all of her concentration to the movements she must make. In the 4 months since her talk with the mistress, Evie had been very busy because of the increasing outlaw attacks in the area. Katha had initiated daily weapons and self-defense drills for all women and older girls, in addition to weapons work and her regular chores. The mistress and Mira had greatly increased the reading Evie was required to do, insisting that she stay up till late at night to finish if necessary. Evie didn't mind, for the things she had learned were fascinating. At first, she was given books and journals about the world just before the change. These books told her a great deal more than her folk learning or the classes she had taken here at the garden. Like every child in the district, Evie had been told that the change occurred when the wild Dinas ate up the machine's food. She had always assumed that the machines had been animals of some sort, made by men but at least half alive. Now she learned that they had been constructed of metal and were no more alive than a house. Their food had been a special kind of oil, which came from the ground where it had been formed millions of years ago. Burning these oils gave the machines the power to move and to perform their miraculous work. Other things had been made of oil, which was changed in a special way: clothing, machine parts, and even some kinds of furniture. Evie learned that the area where she lived had once been just a small part of a vast nation, populated from one great ocean to another, and that across those oceans had been other nations just as great and populous. Even more astonishing, she learned that in the days before the change, most women had looked forward to childbearing, which had been nearly without danger, and in some cases could even choose the sex of their child rather. She read of these and many other marvels of life before the change, not understanding how they all fit together. The mistress promised that it would all become clear at the initiation. There was a full moon that night. By chance, Evie took it as a good sign. The moon always made her think of Zach, and she knew he would be pleased and proud if he could know what was happening tonight. The younger children had been put to bed early. Dark curtains had been drawn across all the windows of the long, low lab building. Evie had hoped that she would be allowed to bring Baby to the ceremony. Her pet's presence always comforted her, but Baby, who usually waited until after Evie was asleep to push her way past the window slats to hunt, had inexplicably demanded to be let out after the evening meal. Once outside, she had begun to set up such a howling that Gunda had gone out and shooed her away from the lodge. The little animal had seemed nervous and excitable all day, once snapping at Evie in irritation. Evie wondered if her pet was perhaps in heat, and if it could be dangerous for her to mate with a wild fox cat. She resolved to discuss the matter with Gunda and Lucille the next day. Or perhaps she decided Baby's unsettling mood was due simply to the presence of the full moon, or to her own barely suppressed excitement. Evie and Lucky, dressed carefully in clean tunics and long southern fashion skirts, then took turns twisting each other's hair into adult knots at the back of the neck. They had been warned not to discuss the rite and chattered nervously of inconsequential matters. Lucky giggled often, but with an edge of nervousness Evie had never before heard in her voice. Evie tried to sound and appear calm, but she found herself continually touching her feathered bracelet as if it somehow contained Zach's reassuring presence. When they were satisfied with their appearance, the girls sat side by side on benches in the women's quarters where they would hereafter sleep. There was a knock on the door, and Evie and Lucky looked at each other, then rose and followed Gunda out across the moonlit yard to the lab. Evie had never before been in this adults-only preserve. Like the mistress's cabin, the walls of the lab were lined with row upon row of books, and mysterious metal and glass instruments were neatly arranged on 4 long, chest-high wooden tables. Gathered solemnly at one end of the room were the senior women of the garden, each wearing a loose-fitting white jacket over her clothing. Flickering candles and fish oil lamps cast a dark glow across the room and the faces of the women in it. The mistress was seated on a stool among the other women. Gunda conducted Evie and Lucky down the aisle between the high, narrow tables. Evie's heart was pounding so hard she was sure it could be heard, and her hands were cold and damp. Although she was aware of the women of the garden looking on, she felt as if she and the mistress were the only 2 people in the entire world. Evie, daughter of Eugenia, the old woman said. Lucky, daughter of Lucille. You have been called to the garden. You have been given the choice to leave or to stay. This is your last opportunity to affirm your decision. If you choose to stay, you will devote your entire life to our cause. You will do as our leaders ask, always instantly without question, and you will do this for the highest good there is, the future of the human race. Do you understand? Evie nodded. Yes, she said. Yes, murmured Lucky. Evie could feel the younger girl trembling next to her. She reached out and took Lucky's hand. The mistress gazed at both of them for what seemed a very long time, then spoke again. Repeat after me. I am a daughter of the garden. Both girls repeated the phrase in unison. I belong to the garden and to all humankind. The will of the leaders is my will, and the good of mankind my goal. I will live my life in service as the daughter of the garden. When they had finished the vow, Lucky had stopped trembling, and Evie felt exhausted. Now Gunda, Hilda, and a handful of other women approached, carrying handwritten scrolls. They stood in a semicircle around the mistress, facing Evie and Lucky. Then the mistress began to speak again. We tell the story of the garden whenever we receive new daughters. We tell it so we will not forget. We tell it so that the good can go on and the evil that has been done may remain buried. We preserve, we build, and we create, for we are the scientists of the garden. Afterwards, Evie could remember only the smoking candles and the sound of the words, but not the words themselves. A year ago, she would have been shocked to learn that the women of the garden were scientists, whom she had always believed to be the worst kind of criminals. But now the knowledge seemed natural, expected, and comforting. She had read enough of the ancient and near past to know that almost everything she had believed her whole life was superstition and untruth. As the senior women had related the story of the change in sing-song rhythm, Evie imagined she was witnessing the events they described. She could visualize the great ships moving, the oil needed by machines from countries where it was plentiful to those where it was not. She saw the seas crowded with tankers the size of cities and watched the waters become dark and foul as there were accidents. Several women read together in mournful tones, telling how the sickly black oil began to accumulate on the waters, spoiling them, choking the seaweed, fishes, and birds. Evie imagined she could see clots of oil washing onto the beaches, streaking them with dark slime and killing the animals who lived there. All this while were scientists at work in labs, in secret, men and women both. They found the key to life within all creatures. They used it to unlock forbidden doors. This deadly secret key was DNA, so small it could not be seen, but only known, and yet it has the power to make life. They learned to work with DNA and change it. Now Lucille, Lucky's mother, began to read. And so our fathers thought to change the world, to help all men and with their new secret knowledge. They changed the DNA inside E. coli and gave it appetite to eat spilled oil. And thus was born the mighty petrophage. In spite of the difficult words, Evie had no trouble following the story as other women took it up. How the petrophage bacteria had spread first to the ships, which brought them to fresh oil spills, and then through men to all machines on land. Finally, having eaten all the oil, the creatures had changed again and began devouring any products derived from oil. All the senior women were chanting now in a wailing sing-song. Evie felt the back of her neck prickle as the voices grew louder and more insistent. The world, they knew, began to slow and stop, and petrophage had still not done its work. Petrophage now came into the labs where evil scientists were tampering with life, creating fearsome weapons and diseases. To keep these secret horrors from the world were traps and cages made of special oil, but everything was food for the petrophage. Changed DNA was let into the world, attacking, changing human, plants, and beasts. The death and terror spread from place to place, and mothers died in giving birth to daughters. The reading suddenly stopped. Evie started involuntarily, then Gunda went on in a quiet tone of voice. This was the beginning of the change, she said, and this is the hope of change, said Mira. The hope of the change, continued Hilda, is that terrible weapons can never again be made. The hope of the change, added Lucille, is that civilization may one day be restored. The hope of the change, said all the women together, is the hope of the garden. There was a long pause, and then the old woman began to speak conversationally. You may not have understood everything here tonight, but as you study and grow older, you will understand more. The garden is one of several enclaves formed by scientists who survived the change. They were devoted to two causes. First, saving as much knowledge as possible from the past, and second, applying that knowledge in an attempt to undo the damage caused by the change. They were hunted down in those terrible days, and many of them were killed, but some survived and continued to work in secret. That is what we do here. We are scholars preserving past knowledge, and we are scientists working to alter the legacy of the change. This is the most important work there is. If we do not succeed within 2 or 3 generations, there will be no humans left on the earth. The old woman had finished speaking, and Evie saw that her face was wet with tears. She felt profoundly moved and excited and still a little frightened. All these feelings, along with her gratitude towards Zach and her longing for him, were somehow connected in a complicated knot at the base of her spine. Now Gunda stepped forward, holding white coats for Lucky and Evie. "This is the uniform of the scientists," she said. "Welcome to the garden, daughters, and remember that even if someday you should leave the garden physically, your life remains dedicated to our goals." The fish oil lamps had been turned up, and sweets and flowers were set on the large lab tables. Evie and Lucky, both dazed and happy, were being congratulated by the women of the garden, many of them still obviously moved by the ceremony. Evie was just starting to sip a cup of the fragrant gold-colored wine when there was a heart-skipping cry from outside, and the sound of running footsteps. The outlaw attack had begun. As she had been painstakingly trained by Katha, Evie ran with the other women to the shed off the lodge where weapons were stored. Taking up a very light museum sword and a thick stake, Evie stationed herself as she was assigned at the outside entrance to the children's dormitory wing. Hyper alert and with every muscle trembling, Evie realized only when it was over that she was still wearing her white lab coat. The full moon showed her a score of women moving in the yard, their swords clashing with those of the invaders. The outlaws seemed to be very, very few in number, but fierce. It was clear that the garden women were winning. Still, Evie stood ready, prepared to fight, her heart beating quickly, not knowing how she would react, only that she would never allow any harm to come to the garden's children. She jumped as someone touched her, and then she realized it was sweat running down her body under her loose clothing. In spite of the coolness of the night, time seemed to have lost its normal flow. Evie had no idea whether hours had passed since the attack began or only minutes. She found herself wishing Zach was with her and imagining his power and courage flowing into her, giving her strength. She was startled by a noise close by and turned quickly, then gasped. Staggering towards her through the shadows was a man in tattered dark rags, with a crazed look in his eyes. His head he held aloft in both hands a heavy ornate sword. He lifted the sword above his head, grinning crazily, clearing, intending to bring it down on Evie, cutting her in two. For a moment she simply gaped at him, as if he were as unreal as her daydream of Zach. Then her training took over, and she stepped back, lifting her sword, preparing to fight, but her back was pressed against the wall of the lodge, and she realized that she had no room to maneuver, to practice the thrust and counter-thrust Katha had taught her. Never in all her weapon practice had she imagined that she would actually have to use the sword. "I must protect the children," she told herself, and she held the sword in front of her, resolving to do as much injury as she could before her attacker overcame her. She wondered what it would feel like when his sword cut into her flesh, and felt the strength going out of her arm. Her sword started to tremble in her hands as the grinning man began to bring his weapon down. At that moment, there was a sudden eerie howl, as if something long dead had awoken, and the man looked up. His eyes grew wide with terror. Evie turned her head in time to see Baby leaping off the slatted roof of the lodge and landing on the man's chest, with all 4 of her paws outstretched. Her hooked claws extended. The man screamed and fell backwards, dropping the sword as his hands frantically pulled Baby away from his body. Still howling, Baby raked his arm with her claws and bit at his fingers. With a terrified, spastic motion, he at last freed himself and stumbled away as quickly as he could, his sword forgotten. Evie realized she should pursue him, but she felt suddenly so weak it was all she could do to remain standing. Baby shook herself all over and approached and rubbed against Evie's trembling leg with a reassuring meow or mower. Evie knelt and hugged the fox cat. "Thank you, Baby," she said. "You were watching over me all along, weren't you?" In answer, the little animal licked her cheek. After a deep, shuddering breath, Evie resumed her station, holding the sword tightly in both hands. The fox cat sat at her feet, her sharp ears pricked alertly, her tail twitching from time to time as she looked about. Most of the fighting was now moved to the south wall, away from Evie's view. Despite Baby's presence, she prayed it would not return to the lodge. She heard shouts and one horrible scream, a man's shriek, the clash of weapons, curses, the sound of bodies falling heavily, and finally silence. The silence was presently broken by a sudden, surprising sobbing. After a moment, Gunda appeared, her short red hair plastered to her wet, dirty, dirt-smeared face. "It's over," she said. "Put away your weapon and come inside." As Evie relaxed, she realized that her entire body was tense and shaking. Her tunic was stuck to her sides with sweat, and her throat ached from holding back tears. She had been far more frightened than she wanted to admit. Most of the women, except the mistress, were in the lodge. Hilda was preparing herb tea in a large kettle, while Mira and Lucille bandaged minor cuts and wounds. On a long bench, someone was sleeping, exhausted. Suddenly, Evie realized that the woman, a skinny girl named Joan, was not sleeping but was dead. A dark stain of red covered the upper part of her tunic. Evie felt suddenly sick and looked into the fireplace. The loudest sound in the room was the sobbing of the woman who had been Joan's lover. Presently, Hilda offered the sobbing woman a warm drink and led her outside, while Gunda directed that the body be covered and removed. We're going to stop it right here. Oh, we're almost done with this chapter. Wow. Anyways, we've been reading from Pandora's Genes. It is a book by Kathryn Lance. You can get your own copy, I'm sure, or that of the next book in this trilogy called Pandora's Children, and the third of the book of the trilogy, Pandora's Promise, from major book retailers. Anyway, if you like this content, then make sure you like and subscribe, ring the bell so you know when I upload. Also, if you want to support me in any way, all that information will be in the description below. As always, thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great day.